So today I'm going to talk to you about weasels and some of the rehab work we do here with weasels, with young weasels, injured weasels, and then trying to get them back out into the wild. And they really are fabulous little creatures. So we're going to start with Chester. He's with us at the moment, and if we get some brighter weather next week, he's going to be going out. So we've been waiting and waiting. We've had wet weather, windy weather, snowy weather, and we've been waiting for a decent spell of weather to let him go, and he will simply just be released from the enclosure. There won't be any hands on holding him or moving him around. He'll just be released from there, and he'll be then free to come and go as he pleases. So we'll just show you a few clips of him when we have had him in the enclosure. So this is him just having a little scratch and exploring his enclosure, but you can see on weasels they're very distinct under the neck here. They have two little dark spots that you can see. So stoat actually have those. So this is very typical of a weasel. There he is, having a little stretch.
So we've already had a few questions coming in about what Chester's story is and when he was rescued and kind of what he's been up to since.
Yeah, so you see I said all that without moving my lips. So yeah, he's been with us since last year, and we're going to then be releasing him. Quite often we release them, as soon as possible really, but he came in the autumn, so we're then waiting until we can release him when the weather improves, and it is going to next week apparently, so we're going to have a moment to release him. But I'll just show you this Weasel School here. I've shown you this before. This is the smallest carnivore in the world, a little Weasel School. So you can see here how fabulous they are and how much of that cavity space there is made up by brain, but they're also incredibly powerful bite force on those little, just tap the screen wheel and get us in focus. Yeah. Boom, look at that. So this is a Weasel School, and you can see how much is dedicated to brain there. So these are super intelligent little creatures, but incredibly powerful. And I'll compare that to a lion. This is a cast of a lion skull, aluminium cast. So lions are all jaw, and poor things, they don't have much of a brain in there, do they? There's only a little brain about the size of my fist in there, so that's all jaw. So if you're a lion, I'm afraid you're not that bright, but you're very powerful compared to a weasel. But to me, a weasel's got it all. It's intelligent and powerful, and you can just see, just a simple demonstration again there, how much of that skull there is taken up with brain cavity compared to one of our largest carnivores that we have, the lion. So you can see, yeah, silly lion, very clever weasel. So so who are we going to look at next?
We've got a few more clips of Chester to go through. So one of the signs that he is kind of getting ready to release is this one.
Yeah, I mean, this happened quite soon if it's the one I'm thinking of. So I popped him in this enclosure, and what I didn't realise, there was actually a vole living in his enclosure before I shut the door on it. And being a weasel, he made short work of that little vole, and he got himself a little dinner. So it's obviously, in our country, in the UK, it's illegal to put live prey in with mammals. This has happened by accident, but it just shows he's quite capable of hunting when he heads out into the wild, that he's managed to catch that in quite a large enclosure. So it's a good sign, not for the vole, but a good sign for the weasel, that he's already capable of hunting before we release him. Look at him, he's really pleased with himself there, doing a little dance for us, showing off his little vole.
And then afterwards,
yes, this is him sort of asleep in the nest, and this is something very few people get to see, is an actual sleeping weasel. So this is a habitat that I've built. I've had wild weasels living in here as well, so I open up the enclosure's doors, and wild weasels have actually gone into there as well. The area was originally built for the wild weasels, and the enclosure came round it later, and those doors open and close depending whether we have a rescue weasel. Look at, he's got his little tongue out there. having a little dream. Superb. So, but again, you see that little cheek patch under there, which is a very weasel trait, and a jagged line, which is really obvious on this little clip, a jagged line in between his white and his brown, whereas stoats have a straight line, unless you're in Ireland. Yeah, so have we got any more of him, or are we on to Wendy?
On to the next one, to Wendy. So Wendy.
So this is a weasel that was being hand-reared by Jean, and you can see a little delicate operation. It's a little bit bigger than like one of my fingers. Sometimes these are as small as 9 to 10 grams when we get them in. Jean quite often raises them. I've raised them from this sort of size before. It's a lot of work feeding them throughout the night, but once you get them feeding on solid foods, they're away to, they're away and you can get them going. But you've got to be so careful when you're feeding them at that stage that you don't actually flood their lungs and either drown them or give them pneumonia. So it's a very, very delicate operation feeding a little mammal of that size. But fabulous little things. This is Wendy. That's her as a tiny, tiny little kit, and this is her just before we released her. And they all have a sense of fun and mischief. This is just hilarious footage here. I put all this moss in there for something for her to play in, moss and dead grasses, and she absolutely loved it. It was like a little trampoline for her. She spent ages on here bouncing backwards and forwards.
And what kind of signs do you look for that they're ready for release when you're rehabilitating them?
Well, naturally in the wild they become independent from even as young as 8 weeks, but certainly by 9, 10, 11 weeks they're independent. So potentially they could go out into the wild from that age, but weasels are very tricky little things to release. Stoats are much easier because they're bigger, they've got more resources. Whereas weasels, you get a few days of bad weather, and these, unless they find somewhere very safe to sleep each night, can become quite quickly, they perish really. So they're tiny, 65 grams this little weasel was, so tiny, tiny little thing.
And speaking about tiny weasels.
Oh, these are tiny, teeny, weeny. So this is when the weasel obsession started. I followed this weasel right the way from the first time I saw her in March through to her actually breeding, and I actually built a nest for her. And this is one of my favourite clips I've ever captured, a weasel moving her kits, and these kits are 17 days old. Quite incredible moment. So I was actually there managing to film this really unusual sequence of her moving her kits from one nest to another. Absolutely fabulous stuff to actually be there to witness. So that's a wild weasel living in my garden. Unfortunately, the stoats got her as the kits became sort of teenagers, but I took over the last bit of raising them, and one of those little kits stayed with us for nearly 2 years. So in the garden, just right outside here. So absolutely fabulous things. So what are you going to hit me with next, Will? Some questions?
We have got questions,
yep.
Yes. So one of the first ones actually harks back to what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Kate Fulcher on Twitter is asking, how strong is a weasel's bite?
Really, really, really strong. So in general, the smaller things get, the more strong they are. Like a beetle, some of the beetles are super strong, like the dung beetles, and it's just the bigger the animal for the size, they lose power. So small predators, little carnivores like weasels, have got for their size, have the strongest bite force. There's lots of figures banding around. I did a natural world program on weasels, and there's a lot of time spent trying to work out the bite force of a weasel. I've been bitten by weasels several times, and I know it is extreme. And just for a little predator, and what they tend to do is then actually twist the head as they bite as well. They like to, and especially when they catch the prey, they twist and spin and bamboozle that prey, but it's the twisting as well that really, really gets you. The bite force, Will, what's it?
164 psi.
Apparently. I don't know how they've tested it and what they've tested it with, but I've sort of, as part of this program, there was a huge amount of debate of how they would test this bite force on the weasel. And yeah, it's getting a weasel to bite something at full force that's a bite force tester. I'm not convinced that it's fully scientific. I know when you get bitten by one, yeah, it's proper painful, and I've had blood poisoning from a weasel bite before as well. So yeah, a lot of respect for those weasels.
I think it's very interesting. As you were comparing it with the lion's bite force, obviously it's all per inch, per centimetre, is only 111. So actually, for its size, it's got a stronger bite than a lion.
Yeah, so we have muscles that a lot of carnivores have this crest on the skull. So all these muscles go around and they're attached to the from the jaw around to the skull through here. So that's where the bite force comes from. The weasel doesn't have a crest, but it has all this surface area across its skull, massive surface area where these muscles are then joined to create that bite force. Yeah, but quite incredible little things. Teeth are like absolute needles. Should we do a close-up of teeth for you all? Are we in focus?
Yeah, we are. You can keep coming in if you like.
Oh, let's go.
Try and focus on that. Yeah, you can see them there.
Yeah.
Beautiful. The next question comes from Jane Fulcher. Do weasels eat snakes? And do you worry about animals like Chester when you've released them into the wild?
Yeah. So weasels will potentially take sort of snakes, maybe little snakes, but they certainly will catch reptiles and things, and they can catch insects sometimes. But the main diet is rodents, small birds, eggs, and things like that. They prefer that sort of food. But if they get hungry, I'm sure a small snake could be potentially on the menu. Yeah. And what was the other part of the question?
Do you worry about animals like Chester when you release them into the wild?
Of course I do. Yeah. We get very attached to these animals that we work with here, whether they're actually the wild animals or the animals that we've spent time rehabilitating. And of course worry about them, especially a weasel. Weasels are literally the hardest thing to successfully release. They are the most difficult because of their size. We've got owls in the garden. We've got stoats in the garden, and they're a predator, but they're on the lower level of being a predator. And when they're raised in captivity, they don't quite have that sort of super senses. They're a little bit dumbed down from a proper wild weasel that's literally absolutely wired. It's taking everything in all the time because it knows of the dangers, whereas a hand-reared, it's been reared in captivity, more or less. It's not going to be easy for him, and we just hope he succeeds, touch wood. But the other option is just to keep him his entire life in an enclosure. So is he best having a short life in the wild, or potentially a long life in the wild, or just a long life in captivity? And so we will try and get him out into the wild next week, I think.
So Sue R has just asked, can you give us a bit of backstory on Chester? Where was he rescued from, and what's he being released from?
Yeah, so he was rescued from Chesterfield. A couple found him there, and he was left by his mother. Probably lost in transit, so they move from nest to nest. So if they come across things like dog walkers, traffic on roads, they can sometimes drop the kit and then not manage to. They get confused if they've got 5, 6, 7 kits as to how many they've got in their new nest, and they can get disturbed obviously and drop the kit. So we get a few almost every year to rehab and try and get them back into the wild here. So
and the other question was what he's being released from.
Just the enclosure. It's just literally in the garden down there. So he's been released from there. So he's got his nest, he's got food, and the door will just be opened and he can then come and go. I have a door that's got mesh on it about this big, so he can pass through back and forth. But stoats can't get into that area, so that's like a safe area for him.
We have a question from Space Llama on YouTube who says, what is the largest prey item you've seen a weasel take?
I've seen him take young rats. It's the largest prey item, and I saw a weasel that female weasel we watched moving the kits when those kits were 42 or 47 days old. She took them to a rat's nest in the garden, and I could hear the commotion, and she'd taken her little family outing to try and take on a rat's nest, which was very brave and very challenging. And I saw a young weasel that was only in its infancy. It's probably the first thing it caught was a rat, so that was a rat just slightly bigger than the weasel, and it succeeded. Quite a battle.
Jenny Wiles asks, have you seen the photo on Facebook of a weasel flying on a woodpecker's back? Do you think this is real or just Photoshopped?
No, I think it is totally real. It's a photograph that was circulating a few years ago, and fabulous photograph. The person who took it was actually photographing the woodpeckers. I think it was in a London park, was it?
It might be right.
Yeah, and he was photographing the woodpeckers there and creeping up on them, and obviously this commotion happened, and I 100% believe that person has taken that photograph. It's almost too crazy to make up, that's the thing. And it's the woodpecker got away, the woodpecker landed again. So there's a full sort of story on that photograph if you search it out as to what happened there. But yeah, I completely believe it.
Victoria B, one of our moderators, is asking, how have you been feeding live food to Chester? And if not, will Chester instinctively know how to hunt?
Yeah. So we can't feed live food to Chester, and I probably wouldn't anyway. It's hardly fair on the things that you put in with it. But we have seen that vole that he caught live, and that was just it wasn't an accident, but it was just something that happened. I closed the enclosure door and put him in there, and there was a vole already in there. I've had frogs and toads in there before, and I've managed to scoop them out before the weasels have got them. He will just know. He's a born little predator. He's a weasel.
What's the next question we've got here? So, if you remember, Rob, Chester chewed off the side of his cave. What do we think this was about?
This cave?
You know the wooden structure that he's in? He came out and had that.
Oh, yeah.
He was chewing.
Oh, it's just doing a bit of maintenance.
Spring cleaning.
Yeah. I mean, they're just full of fun and full of mischief, and he's probably just busy entertaining himself really by doing that.
Next one. Do you see any other wild weasels in the garden now?
Not just at the moment. I haven't seen a wild weasel for a little while in the garden, and quite often at this time of year we start getting them passing through. So he potentially has got this place to himself if he keeps himself away from the stoats. He should be fine.
Jeff Nielsen is asking, what milk do you feed the kits on?
It's a milk called Esbalac, and that's like a puppy formula, and it's the best one. So you can have some that you can feed them, and the kits just sort of don't thrive on them, but Esbalac is the one that we use.
And I think that's all of the questions we've got time for today. Thank you everyone for sending them in.
Okay, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.